This video is about saving your life if you have cancer. Or maybe it's about saving your mom's life, your friend's life, or the life of someone else you love. It's critical because the odds are terrifying. Surviving metastatic cancer for even 5 years is unlikely. Even scarier, whatever you heard from your doctor about your survival timeline was probably overly optimistic. Doctors tend to tell their patients their likelihood of survival and life expectancy are far better than they actually are. But there's also good news. Preliminary data about keto and fasting is promising. It seems they can help fight cancer, decrease the side effects of other treatments, and make other treatments more effective. Several of the most popular books touching on cancer mention these as the best self-help options, but they also say we don't have many good, real-life human survival studies yet. And they don't tell us exactly what the real-life human studies actually show. If I were you, I'd want more specifics. This video will tell you the theoretical background for how keto and fasting are supposed to work and the theoretical limitations. We'll start simple, and eventually we'll probably go deeper than you've ever been into this kind of science. We'll tell you what the most prominent researcher in the field concludes from the data, including how to do this properly. There is good reason to be very optimistic if you do it right. And we'll provide you with the actual research results so you can see for yourself. We'll apply the most up-to-date science available. For links to the actual journal publications, just check the description box below. How keto and fasting beat cancer. The mechanism. Fasting increases something called autophagy. Autophagy is the process of killing off cells that aren't working right and then reusing those nutrients. Autophagy also seems to increase production of various cells related to the immune system. We even see brand new stem cells. But we really don't know much about autophagy or its level of benefit. Beyond autophagy, we know much more about how keto and fasting can help us kill cancer by starving it. Cancer needs a lot of energy to fuel its growth, but it also creates energy less efficiently. Cancer ferments, meaning it produces energy without oxygen rather than producing energy with oxygen. It's an inefficient process that only turns 1 unit of blood sugar into 2 units of energy. By comparison, the healthy cells in our body usually produce more than 15 times that amount of energy from 1 unit of blood sugar. That means cancer needs far more energy from blood sugar just to function. And of course, it needs even more than that in order to grow quickly. Here's a quote from a journal. "The intensive growth and proliferation of cancer cells require constant energy. Cancer cells need significantly more glucose than normal cells. Glucose, by the way, is blood sugar. Cancer's probably in big trouble if we can cut down on our blood sugar. We just need to find a way to do that, to cut down on our blood sugar. Blood sugar primarily comes from eating carbs. If we eat very few carbs, our body starts breaking down fat and maybe some protein in order to create energy. That creates less blood sugar and more ketones, an alternative energy source for our body. The protein we eat can also convert to blood sugar, but not very readily. And almost no fat gets converted to blood sugar. Fat mostly converts to ketones. So keto, a very low-carb, high-fat diet, and fasting decrease blood sugar and increase ketones. Cancer cells can't use ketones for energy unlike our normal cells. Keto and fasting should starve cancer cells of the energy they desperately need. Normal cells, on the other hand, should be fine. A perfect solution to cancer. Well, it might not be so perfect, actually. Some researchers believe cancer cells can switch back to producing energy like a normal healthy cell in the body. That is, these researchers notice that some cancer cells start using oxygen. So if cancer can make energy like a normal cell, does that mean that keto and fasting won't help us beat the disease? To an extent, perhaps, though there's probably still huge benefit to forcing cancer to stop using energy in a fermentation process and start using energy with oxygen like a normal healthy cell. In other words, we can probably still beat the disease if we can just starve it of blood sugar and force it to start behaving like a normal cell instead of fermenting all the time. Researchers believe that cancer needs fermentation, this energy production without oxygen, in order to be very dangerous. This is for a number of reasons. The first is that fermentation is a way of producing energy much faster. Though fermentation produces less than 1/15 of the same amount of energy as production through oxygen, it's 100 times faster. It requires a lot of blood sugar, but enables cancer to grow super fast. Fermentation also benefits cancer by creating building blocks. Fermentation doesn't produce much energy per 1 unit of blood sugar, but it creates a lot of other things that cancer can use to make more cancer cells. Another way fermentation benefits cancer is by turning off a cellular timer that would kill cells that reproduce too much. Normally, a cell would die off if it produces a lot of energy through oxygen. It's theoretically a safety mechanism that helps the body determine if a cell is behaving like cancer and then kill it off when it starts to do so. But if the cancer cell produces energy by fermentation instead of with oxygen, it bypasses that timer and doesn't die. If we can force cancer to start producing energy with oxygen, it turns that timer back on and can allow our body to kill off that cancer cell. Producing energy without oxygen also allows cancer to outcompete the various other cells around it. Fermentation creates acidity around the cancer cell, too much acidity for normal cells to thrive in. And fermentation seems to provide even more benefits to cancer cells, but we won't go into all of those benefits. You get the idea. Fermentation allows cancer to overwhelm us. Real-life data in humans seems to confirm that this fermentation process allows cancer to grow out of control and overwhelm. When cancers become really aggressive, they're fermenting a lot more instead of using oxygen. Cutting off their ability to ferment a bunch of blood sugar might be key to slowing cancer down enough for our immune system to kill it. Another group of researchers think that all cancer cells must ferment, that they can't produce energy with oxygen. If that's true, then lowering blood sugar through fasting and keto should be an amazing solution. We should be able to starve cancer easily by decreasing blood sugar. But there's one more problem. Cancer cells might prefer using blood sugar for energy, but they can also use a substance called glutamine. They might not do as well on glutamine, but they can supplement their normal energy supply with it. That suggests we should reduce our glutamine as well as our blood sugar. But dang it, reducing glutamine is hard. It's the #1 amino acid in our bodies. It's highly prevalent. We also don't know much about the impact of reducing glutamine. Reductions in glutamine are at least associated with sepsis. We don't want that. There are glutamine-blocking drugs, but they have some serious side effects. Researchers are looking at pulsing glutamine-blocking drugs to enhance the effectiveness of maybe keto or fasting without those side effects. That research hasn't been published yet. More on that later. Another option is to leave glutamine alone and just do our very best to reduce blood sugar as much as possible through keto and fasting. That should starve cancer or stop it from fermenting. Now let's look at the conclusions of the most prominent researcher in this field. If you listen to scientists give interviews on starving cancer, one name keeps popping up over and over again: Dr. Thomas Seyfried. He's a researcher based out of Boston College, and he does a lot of interviews on top of his research in journal publications. He concludes all cancer cells must ferment. They can't create energy with oxygen. That would suggest starving cancer is the way to go, one treatment for all forms of cancer. He does acknowledge that other researchers have good reason to think that cancer uses oxygen to produce energy in some circumstances. Those researchers do see that cancer is using up oxygen, but he says that his research indicates that that use of oxygen is for a different purpose. It's not for the purpose of producing energy. His next conclusion is that we need to be very strict about our eating if keto is going to be effective in starving cancer. He says we only start to see benefits when we get our ratio of blood sugar to ketones down to 2:1. You can instead simply say 2, the first number in the ratio, since the second number is always 1. This simplified way of referring to the ratio only by the first number is called the GKI. You'll hear this term, GKI, a lot in the scientific literature about using keto and fasting to cure cancer. Dr. Seyfried says that cancer really seems to be in trouble when we get this ratio down to 1:1, meaning 1 part blood sugar and 1 part ketones. Again, you could just say GKI of 1, the first number in the ratio, since the second number is always 1. You can measure this ratio with a device called Keto Mojo. By the way, there are many competing devices on the market, such as ones that use urine strips or maybe just measure your breath. Most of those don't seem to be very accurate. You probably need something that measures your blood sugar with a needle prick. Keto Mojo is one of the best known of these. It's also set up to calculate your ratio of blood sugar to ketones, your GKI. Dr. Seyfried, the famous researcher we're talking about now, was among the researchers who actually invented this GKI. They did it in a research paper in which they demonstrated the importance of getting blood sugar low and ketones up in preliminary human survival data. Now, even skeptical researchers are calling for future studies to include GKI data. Seyfried's third conclusion may frustrate or otherwise bother some of the viewers. He says it's hard to get into a ketogenic enough state if you're eating a plant-based diet. A diet of mostly fatty meats works better. If you find that ridiculous, then maybe just look past this conclusion and focus on his others. By the way, he does say it is possible to get a low GKI on a vegan diet, but unfortunately plants contain more carbs. Others would argue meat itself is an important component of curing cancer. Seyfried avoids that debate, at least as far as I'm aware, but he does say that his research is consistent with how humanity probably ate prior to farming. There's a video you can watch about that by clicking up here. Contrary to what most of us have probably heard, recent science increasingly indicates humans ate primarily meat and very few carbs through the vast majority of our evolution. We see this from things like isotope testing of human remains. Now let's take a look at the actual study results involving cancer patients who fast or eat keto. There isn't much peer-reviewed data on fasting's impact on cancer. Fasting for several days seems to be well tolerated, reduce the side effects of other treatments, and improve cancer treatment markers. For example, there's a 2009 case report of 10 patients who fasted for several days before and after a chemo treatment. They reported no side effects from the fasting. They also reported feeling better than when they underwent chemo without fasting, and it didn't interfere with the effectiveness of the treatment. A 2020 study of 30 patients had them fast for several days during 2 of their 4 chemo cycles. When fasting, they felt better, had better markers for tolerating the chemo, and had fewer postponements of the chemo treatments, further suggesting people were feeling better. But there aren't many of these studies. They're pretty small, and they don't tell us actual survival rates. They just tell us how fasting improved various cancer markers. Improvements in what are believed to be markers often do not translate into longer lifespan in other kinds of research. More on that later. We have at least one questionnaire-style study of almost 2,500 women with breast cancer. It looked at women who fasted for most of the day and then had shortened eating windows. The women who only ate during a shortened window had a 36% decreased risk of the cancer returning after treatment. At first, that seems like a great result, but actually for this kind of study design, it's barely a large enough difference to even be recognizable because of the many sources of potential error. Published real-life human survival data on fasting just hasn't arrived yet. One would think that it would work very well to help beat cancer. Blood sugar levels drop to a sustained amount of 70, which is very low, even compared to a keto diet. But obviously, we can't stay in a fasting state. We'd eventually die. We have to at least have periods when we eat and hopefully still keep our blood sugar low when we're doing that. And that's where keto comes in. We have much more data on the impact of keto on cancer. Many studies fairly clearly show that when you eat keto, it does help with various other kinds of treatment that you might be getting. These preliminary studies show that it decreases the side effects of radiation and chemo. It also seems to increase the effectiveness, at least in the short term. For example, let's look at a short clinical trial of about 130 breast cancer patients receiving chemo. The ones who adhered to the keto diet, as measured by blood work, had more reductions in cancer size and improvements in other markers, including DNA damage to normal cells. And keto has proved to help with cancer patients' weight. People who had gotten weak from treatments gained some weight, and people who were overweight got their weight down. That's incredibly important because sometimes cancer patients waste away, whereas other cancer patients need to lose weight and get off some insulin. Insulin spurs cancer's growth. Reducing blood sugar also reduces the levels of insulin and insulin-like growth factors, which are important drivers of cancer cell proliferation. Now for some disappointing news. At least one reviewer concluded there is currently a paucity of evidence to suggest that a low-carbohydrate diet amongst a general population of cancer patients will improve cure rates. But when you look closer, it seems Seyfried is correct. Data implies the diet needs to be strict in order to be effective. Studies that were more flexible with carbs were not effective. For example, one study looked at the effect of a diet allowing for 60 grams of carbs per day on people with fast-progressing brain cancer. That made it a low-carb diet, but barely. The average period before the cancer progressed was only 5 weeks, and death on average occurred within 32 weeks. Studies with much more strict standards showed much better results. A 2015 Johns Hopkins study looked at a modified Atkins diet rather than a traditional keto diet for people with the same cancers. By the way, a modified Atkins diet is a form of keto diet where more protein is allowed, but still very few carbohydrates and a lot of fat. In the study we're looking at now, they allowed the patients less than 20 grams of carbs per day for people with essentially the same cancers as in the previous study. In this paper, all 7 of the people who complied with the diet survived the 13 months of the study. Remember, in the previous, less strict study, the average survival was just 32 weeks, in other words, 4 months. You're probably wondering, how did those patients do after the 13 months? Unfortunately, with a study of this kind, we don't get much long-term data. We'll get more long-term data when we look at case reports about individuals, so more on that later. We can also look within studies and see that the people who most closely complied with a low-carb requirement fared the best. For example, a 2012 study looked at 10 people with advanced incurable cancer. The study only lasted 1 month, and only 5 of the patients showed remission or stabilization of their cancer during that 1-month time period. But those 5 appear to be the ones who took the diet most seriously, as measured by the 3 times higher levels of blood ketones in their bodies. Similarly, a 2016 German primary care unit looked at the impact of keto on tumor size progression over a study of 10 months. This study looked at the 78 patients who were within that primary care unit's ward. The people who closely followed a ketogenic diet, as measured by the ketones in their actual blood, did very well. One of those people who was adhering to the keto diet saw that his cancer didn't grow at all, and all of the others saw their cancers shrink, at least according to the markers that were being measured. A clear trend was observed in patients who adhered strictly to a ketogenic diet, with one patient experiencing a stagnation in tumor progression and others an improvement in their condition. This is what the study says about the people who stopped their ketogenic diet. Those patients who had started on a strict ketogenic diet but then stopped it experienced initially a remission of the disease or the metastasis, which rebounded once they stopped the diet, frequently with lethal consequences. In 2020, Cedars-Sinai published case reports for 12 brain cancer patients with very short survival expectations. This is one of the most interesting studies simply because of the level of detail tracked and reported. If you're only going to read one study, this one might be a good choice. Like a case study of a single person, you get details about each person's struggles, blood sugar, and ketones. All 12 patients started out trying to eat a modified Atkins diet or keto diet. As mentioned before, a modified Atkins diet is a high-fat, low-carb diet that allows for a bit more protein. The study itself only lasted 4 months, but the researchers tracked many of the patients until 2018, which was about 3 years after the study began for some of the patients. Everyone who followed the diet lived as long as the researchers kept track. 3 of the people didn't stay on the diet, and only 1 of those people lived long enough to survive the data collection period cutoff date. It seems the main challenge in winning this war is maintaining a strict ketogenic diet. Case studies, meaning studies that report on a single person's situation, give us more information about how single survivors managed to do it. There are numerous case studies of people who used keto to keep highly aggressive cancers at bay for long periods and perhaps indefinitely. From what I've seen, more than half of these have a surprising commonality. They state that the patient ate primarily meat in order to maintain a low GKI, or a low ratio of blood sugar to ketones. Here's a quote. The patient refused standard of care, SOC, and steroid medication after initial diagnosis, but was knowledgeable and self-motivated enough to consume a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet consisting mostly of saturated fats, minimal vegetables, and a variety of meats. The patient used the glucose ketone index calculator to maintain his glucose ketone index, or GKI, near 2.0. And that was for somebody who had a very, very aggressive cancer. It could be an even higher percentage of survivors ate primarily meat. Many of the studies simply don't tell us. The previously mentioned case reports from Cedars-Sinai, the ones with the added details on people's struggles, also suggest it's difficult to maintain a sufficiently ketogenic diet on a plant-based diet. Several of the patients who started out on a traditional keto diet chose to switch to an Atkins diet because it allowed them to eat foods higher in protein. The study also specifically mentioned one of the patients was vegan and unable to maintain the diet because of difficulties with social events. In 2023, Dr. Seyfried published a somewhat odd yet relevant case study involving a dog. That dog had a large visible tumor on its face. Its owner tried to treat the cancer by feeding the dog a diet of raw vegetables and fish, but the tumor continued to grow. Seyfried switched the dog to a diet of meat and oil. The tumor disappeared, and the dog lived another 12 years. It's also worth noting that for people to do well on a ketogenic diet, it seems that they need real food rather than something that's highly processed. The clinical studies that supplied artificial diets uniformly failed to show any hints for the clinical benefits of their ketogenic diets. Data on the combined effectiveness of keto and fasting doesn't seem to really exist within reputable, peer-reviewed publications. There is a very short 8-week clinical trial involving 21 people with very dangerous brain cancers eating a low-carb Atkins diet 5 days a week and fasting the other 2 days a week. But it wasn't long enough to really learn much. Blood levels of ketones looked good, people got stronger, and people tolerated the diet well. Strategies that combine the tolerability of the modified Atkins diet, abbreviated MAD, with intermittent fasting to restrict caloric intake may prove optimal. Let's talk about a plant-based diet next. If you've been following along with our channel's other videos, you can skip this section by going straight to this time code. So, what does the recent science say about eating certain plants to heal cancer? The highest levels of science have become increasingly skeptical of whether eating certain plants will make you live long or heal cancer. More recent studies show these studies contained a huge error stemming from our past beliefs. The fact is, Americans and Europeans have heard for generations that they should be eating more plants for better health. So if you came from those places and were trying to be really healthy, you ate a lot of plants. Now, if you were interested in health, you probably also did a number of other things that you believed were healthy aside from eating lots of plants. You exercised, tried to keep your weight under control, avoided smoking and excessive alcohol, didn't do steroids, etc. That led to a misleading correlation in these studies between people eating plants and their health. We now know that people who don't exercise much are about 300% more likely to die of all kinds of disease than people who exercise regularly. People with diabetes are at a 200% greater risk of heart disease. Smoking increases many cancer and heart disease risks by hundreds and even thousands of percent, and the list goes on and on. Yet the people eating large numbers of plants only lived a relatively short time longer, despite having all these other health advantages. Of course, the people running these studies tried to statistically adjust the results to compensate for the fact that these people who were eating plants were also doing these other healthy things. But it's hard to take what is already flawed data and improve it by factoring in yet more flawed data. The people running these studies also tried to use various health markers other than disease occurrence and death. If you are a researcher, you might notice that a certain substance in the body is associated with increased cancer risk. That substance would then be a believed marker for cancer. So you run a short-term controlled study of plant consumption that shows a decrease in that marker. The problem is that substance was identified as a marker in the same flawed observational studies. For example, the US government allowed these kinds of markers to be the basis for fast-track approval of cancer medications. It was faster to run shorter clinical trials that just looked at these markers than to run longer clinical trials and see how these drugs actually affected survival rates. After approval, we learned that only 20% of these drugs improved patient survival at all. Running controlled trials for markers is an incredibly unreliable science. If scientists instead broaden their perspectives to look beyond the places that follow European and American beliefs about health, we see a very different picture. According to 2023 UN agency data, the longest-lived areas of the world that have populations over 40,000 people are Hong Kong and Macau. Hong Kong has been the longest-lived region in the world since about 2010. According to UN agency data, Hong Kong consumes the most meat in the world per capita. Hong Kong residents are not eating many plants compared to other populations. According to 2023 UN agency data, the second longest-lived region in the world is Macau. 2023 UN agency data shows Macau has the third highest meat consumption in the world. 2023 UN agency data shows Japan is the third longest-lived region in the world. The first statistical commonality among Japan's longest-lived citizens is increased consumption of animal proteins, not plants. In 2022, a group of researchers noticed this trend towards criticizing studies that show plants are healthier than meat. They looked at UN agency data for 175 regions across the world. This was as close to a worldwide study as possible, and it showed a fairly straight-line correlation. The more meat and less plants people ate, the longer they lived. This was true even after statistical adjustments for things like food availability and access to healthcare. The research coming. Admittedly, we still don't have great research showing the power of a very low-carb, high-fat diet, but some great studies are coming, and very soon. Cedars-Sinai, the group that had done the best study so far, is in the midst of a large-scale, many-year trial. Dr. Seyfried, prominent researcher, says he's fine-tuning research on dosing of a glutamine-blocking drug. This, combined with the appropriate keto diet, could far more effectively and quickly kill cancer. And many other studies on keto and fasting are starting up. Hang in there. Help is coming. Of course, you might be worried that eating so much meat would be bad for your heart health. So in the next video, we'll take a look at exactly that. Thanks for watching.